to pick up on leisure or leisure. That's what made philosophy possible. Plato had lots of leisure. And a few other people in Athens had a lot of leisure because Athens was a very rich, wealthy culture. Didn't have hot and cold running water, but had plenty of free time because it didn't have to. There were a few people that didn't have to work hand to mouth. A lot of other people did. A little more than 2,500 years ago, Plato gave a lecture to many of the intelligentsia of Athens. Aristotle was one of the people in the audience, Xenophon. The topic of his lecture was a failure. His lecture was a failure. The topic of the lecture was the importance of mathematics for helping to understand the nature of the ideal. For instance, one is an ideal. You can't find one anywhere, but it applies all over the place. The failure was that his most brilliant pupil was Aristotle, who didn't cotton to mathematics. He was a biologist. He was interested in biology. And he had Alexander the Great on his side. And philosophy ended up being oriented towards biology for another almost couple thousand years. By the time we get to the Victorian age, Plato had been forgotten and then revived because, fortunately, even though Aristotle and the people that succeeded him in European history weren't interested much in mathematics, the Arabs were. And they made important developments in mathematics, like algebra, which now we have in our calculators. And because the Arabs kept it alive, they also kept Plato alive. And that's how Plato came back into European culture, and one of the main things that got the Renaissance going. But Aristotle did dominate medieval culture, theology especially. And you can see the Renaissance and the subsequent developments with Galileo and Descartes, Kepler, Copernicus, as the first steps in overturning that biologically oriented philosophy, theology that dominated the Middle Ages. By the time we get to the Victorians, philosophy had become impoverished. For Plato was a mystic. Plato was initiate in the Eleusinian Mysteries. And the Eleusinian Mysteries were just one of the many pursuits of ecstasy and an attempt to discover the fundamental nature of things. How many of you know the Eleusinian Mysteries? Okay, for those of you who don't, it was based on the myth of Demeter and Persephone. Hades kidnapped Demeter's daughter Persephone, took her down into the underground. Demeter was distraught. She complained to her fellow gods and goddesses, but couldn't get their interest going. However, since she was the goddess of agriculture and plants, she hit upon a scheme that she'd stop things from growing. Well, and winter set in. Didn't bother the gods for a while because they lived on ambrosia. But finally, it came across to them that human beings would perish if nothing grew. And without human beings, who would worship the gods? So, finally, they decided to talk to Hades and worked out a compromise. We'll have winter half the year and summer, and Persephone can spend half the year with her mother. It's a story, a myth about birth and death and rebirth. And the Eleusinian Mysteries were built around that myth of death and rebirth. And the culmination, which came after a week of fasting in Athens and a trek of 14 miles across the hills to Eleusis, a secret exercise that people were sworn not to reveal the secret of, and they didn't for 2,000 years. We know just generally that people who experienced the ceremony at Eleusis, which undoubtedly was powered at its culminating moment by psychedelic experience, that it was about learning to die before dying. Pindar, the poet Pindar, describes it that way. It was an experience of dying before dying. And once one has that experience, that terror that besets many human beings of, I'm going to die, can be significantly ameliorated. That mystical, ecstatic experience, near-death experience, was important to Plato and informs his philosophy over and over again. Unfortunately, that got lost. And what survived was the incredible experience of mental acuity that ecstatic, psychedelic experience can provide. So by the time we get down into the Renaissance and the beginnings of modern science, the intellect becomes the fundamental concern of philosophy, the fundamental endeavor of philosophy. And Western philosophy becomes almost exclusively intellectual. One of the benefits is, by focusing on the intellect instead of this murky other stuff, you don't have to worry about what color to paint the fire engine. You just have to think about making things work. Okay? Getting down to these mathematical characterizations, as Isaac Newton did, who was concerned with that observatory over there, and basically established the foundation of our technology, in which he did two things. He said there were two things that can't be found by experiment. They are time and space. So I have to define them. No one had ever defined time and space before Isaac Newton. And it only took him a few weeks to do that. He did it while I was home, because they closed down the university because there was an epidemic, and he went home. He didn't have his alchemy supplies, so he could pursue his real interests. He couldn't work on his trying to uncover the design of the Temple of Solomon. No, he was back at home, just sitting out in the orchard, and got to thinking about gravity and stuff like that, and finally wrote down some stuff, came back, stuck it in a drawer, and went back to alchemy and the Temple of Solomon. And only when he heard that somebody else was publishing something about physics, he said, oh, I've already done that. Here it is. So, space was the second thing he was concerned with. The first thing was time. And he said, in order to do this physics stuff, we cannot use common time. What's common time? Common time is the time measured by the sun. And an hour in common time is 1/12 of the day or 1/12 of the night. Well, as you know, the length of the day varies from summer to winter. That's not good for physics. You can't have your stopwatch keyed in. A sundial is not a good stopwatch. Galileo didn't have stopwatches. It wasn't until the idea of longitude that created the need for a good clock happened over here. Galileo sang. He came from a family of musicians, and his manuscripts were examined back in the 50s in the Vatican Library, the original manuscripts. The fellow was working on them, noticed notations in the margin, figured out that how Galileo timed the falling of objects was by singing. A good singer can sing 30-second notes regularly. So he used his musical ability as a stopwatch. But Newton recognized that having regularity in time was really important. So he said, I will define true, absolute, and mathematical time as opposed to common time, true, absolute, and mathematical time as that which flows evenly without regard to anything external. And that has become the notion of time that dominates our culture. It's very recent development. You can go over to the observatory and look at all the stuff that's happened since then with the history of time. So this intellectual orientation informed the Victorian perspective on Plato and the earlier philosophers. And you get a fellow named F.M. Cornford writing about From Religion to Philosophy, in which he talks about philosophy coming out of the magic of, he didn't call it shamanism, but that's what, he didn't know that term then, but that's what he was talking about. That philosophy came out of shamanism and overcame the magic, the physis, the life force. It put superstition behind and introduced a kind of rationality, but that was the impetus for it. It's a bit like what happened in the US when the Pentecostals became a significant force in American religion. And the mainline churches didn't want these holy rollers having ecstatic experiences in their pews. So they pushed them off to the side. And that was the beginning of the end of spirituality in mainline American religion. And now, as my advisor said to his peers, and my advisor, who was a theologian, said to his peers at one point, and we let that happen on our watch. But going back to Plato, Plato became treated by Victorian times as a purely intellectual, talking about purely intellectual things. And that's the way he's basically taught today. But in fact, if you understand that his experience with the Eleusinian Mysteries and the other mysteries that preceded it, Plato considered himself a Pythagorean. Pythagoras was the direct inheritor of the Orphic tradition, which is another tradition of death and rebirth. Dionysius, who was born, who went down into the underworld and came back. Orpheus, who went down into the underworld. It's all about death and rebirth and how that experience brings spirit to the fore. So if you start looking at Plato, which took me a long time to do because I studied hard and tried to satisfy the requirements of the exams, to start looking at Plato from that perspective, you realize that, one, he has a wonderful description of the possibility of the stage. I don't like to call them stages, but they're kind of types of the psychedelic and other kind of experience. There's a device called the divided line. And if you look at that, he's talking about One level being the level of recreational aesthetic appreciation. Okay. The next level is the psychological, which can be problematic for people in unsupervised and unsupported situations where the contents of the psyche just comes spewing out and gets projected on the world, and terror can ensue. At the stage above that, you get the understanding of theories, and you see the importance of can see the importance of theories and archetypes. Hermann Hesse speaks about that in his book Magister Ludi, or the Glass Bead Game. It's the game that is played by that society that survives the apocalypse. Matching structures, a Bach cantata against Gödel's propositions, for instance. And then another stage where one can get to where one sees how theories are all related. How the world is accessible to human cognition, rationality, because theories are possible. Science and the other human endeavors. And then finally, and Plato used the analogy of the sun, above the divided line is that final burst in which one sees emotionally the fire that burns at the heart of the universe and makes possible mentality. Not cognitive mentality, but the whole ability to make sense intellectually of the world. It's also great in the Symposium. Plato outlines steps one can take to achieving the mystical consciousness, which Plotinus, a few hundred years later, used and says, and his student Porphyry says, Plotinus used Plato's method in order to ascend to the understanding of the one. That got lost in the Middle Ages. One of the promises of psychedelics is that it brings back, it opens up a new avenue for doing philosophy. It opens up a new avenue for philosophers, getting them out of their heads, getting them out of their exclusively intellectual heads into the emotional comprehension, the felt comprehension of the nature of things. And the realization, the possibilities for seeing the world not as a bunch of those material bits that came out of Newton's prescription for what you needed in order to do physics, but to the possibility of understanding that the world, the universe, is made not out of bits of matter, but out of moments of experience. In our culture, we are thoroughly, and we grow up with that, it's atoms and molecules, okay? Andy mentioned at the end of his talk this fellow Alfred North Whitehead, who's incredibly difficult to read because he, like the Buddhists, discovered that language, the language we have with its subject-predicate format, isn't adequate for describing the fluid nature of things. Just like the Buddhists discovered that. And so they came up with meditation techniques, koans and things like that for breaking open that intellectual stuff. Interestingly, this fellow Alfred North Whitehead, who grew up not far from here, said he came to that understanding by studying mathematics and physics. Truly a Platonic endeavor. And he invents a new language, which makes him terribly difficult. Everybody I suggest them to in philosophy say, I've tried, you can't. Even Einstein says, I can't understand Whitehead after they had a few conversations. But my suggestion is that psychedelics open up because, no college professor is going to, no professional philosopher is going to get the time off to go to the Himalayas and spend years in a cave and stuff like that in order to learn these techniques, okay? We're in the commuter hamburger culture, okay? You don't have enough time, maybe have a weekend, okay? So we need a quick and dirty way of getting there. Start off each semester, with a good dose. And then you have something to talk about. But how many of you sat in philosophy classes that go on and on and drone on and on and on? Hey, start it off with a good dose of mushrooms or acid or something, and the discussion is going to be a lot more lively. And we're getting there. I gave up on this stuff, okay, because I was banging my head against the walls of academia. I couldn't find, after my psychedelic experiences, I was fortunate to have one of the few teachers left at the time who actually taught Whitehead. And when I had my first psychedelic experiences, all of a sudden, I saw through Newton's that time and space are abstractions. They're not realities, they're abstractions. And I came to understand that emotion wasn't intellectual understanding, it was, time, gone. Space, there's kind of a little space between us, all of a sudden, gone. Everybody was right there. So, we can give people this experience now, okay? And one of the things that's working against it is this incredible culture of prohibition. My fellow Americans have been great at prohibition, okay? We know how to do it in spades. And when we ran out of being able to prohibit alcohol, marijuana was the next thing. So we prohibited that. And then, bingo, we had a war, and there were all these hippies who were raising problems about the war. That's because they're taking acid. We'll make it a criminal offense. But it's beginning to crumble, okay? Jeff Sessions, I'm sure you all know and love him, ain't going to do it. He's going to try, but he's not going to be able to. Go see Rick Doblin when he talks, okay? 3 or 4 years, MDMA, ecstasy, is going to be a pharmaceutical with a protocol. It's gotten through all the government hurdles. Good friend of mine is the lead investigator. It's going to be there. And Rick Doblin has his little slide of enlightenment stores on every street corner. The seller is that it's a great antidote for depression. And boy, do we have depression. It doesn't take the Donald to make it obvious. So I left academic philosophy, ended up in Tulsa, Oklahoma, the Bible of the Buckle Belt. On the buckle of the Bible Belt. You can see what's happened to my mind. And said, well, psychology's where it's at. So I tried that. It was out of the frying pan and into the fire. Most of the work that's being done now with psychedelics is about psychology. But the real future of psychedelics is philosophy. That's where the real work has to be done, because these things like, what are we going to do when we realize that we're only halfway through evolution on this planet? Whitehead at one point says, when the first creatures crawled up out of the sea, the ones who remained behind were saying, watch out, you are going to get into trouble. And we are in trouble. It's clear. How are we going to get our way through it? As Terry McKenna said, push the art pedal to the floor. Okay? Creativity. Science isn't going to get us through this. Creativity is going to get... Science is only one manifestation of creativity, and we've pushed it pretty far. Okay? creativity, creativity, creativity. And I know the philosophy classes you took in college are not much about creativity, but go back and read about the culture that Plato was in. I mean, Socrates, Plato, Aristotle, these three guys, to have those three people happen one after another was an incredible thing. And they created this endeavor that has led us to the technology where we have hot and cold running water, telephones, cell phones. Okay? Plato is there. Again, recurring to Whitehead, the safest generalization we can make about Western philosophy is that it consists in a series of footnotes to Plato. And in my appreciation, this fellow, Alfred North Whitehead, is what Plato would be today, informed by all the developments in science, especially in science and technology, but sociology, psychology, everything since. So it'd take 10 years of your life to work through him, okay? But he's worth it. And in 50 years, which most of you will see, he's going to be considered probably the most important philosopher of the 20th century. Thank you for having this occasion.